think at heart, I like building things. And I think even when I was at Ricotta or Wiz, the act of standing something up from nothing or standing something bigger up from something small has always been rewarding to me, as opposed to coming into something that's big and built and just cranking that machine that's already been built for you. I think what I like about it is the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the way it forces you to sometimes make decisions where you don't know if it's the right decision. That challenge and applying that to solving kind of real world problems is, I just get a real adrenaline rush and kick out of that. I think I could do that all my life, over and over and over again. It's like going out into really, really rocky ocean and kind of figuring things out as you go through that, and there's no safe harbor. But yeah, I would say that's kind of how I think about it.
All right, guys. So we have another amazing leader here on the podcast, obviously. We've got Ingwon Chae, who's joining us. And to kind of get things started off, we've got a little bit of an interesting perspective on how you guys at Glen Coco are marketing today. And I want to share this with the screen, or with the audience, because this was absolutely killer. And you sent this over to us. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a clip here.
By saying we're a bit more than AI sales software. Glen Coco is building the one-stop platform for businesses that want to grow through outbound sales. Which is to say, the platform provides not just the tooling, but also the labor, the training, the coaching, and the data. Now, businesses spend a lot of money building outbound sales teams.
Obviously. But I'm going to stop sharing here, because that in itself, as just a animated Pixar type piece of animation that communicates you guys, and I'm guessing this is you on the screen as well, is so innovative, man. So tell us where this came from and how do we kind of put some legs behind this idea?
Yeah, well, look, I think the world is changing like crazy. I think AI is going to drive, we're in the early innings basically of all the different kinds of value for businesses and for people, the creativity that AI can unlock. It's a double-edged sword, obviously, because there's questions around, intellectual property, but the backstory behind that video is, I think, I'm sure you guys were all over Twitter or X or all these things when ChatGPT announced their new image model generation, and I started seeing all these Studio Ghibli, memes and things coming up, and it was really starting to blow up. And so I'm a huge Studio Ghibli fan. I love Hayao Miyazaki. I love movies. And so I started kind of playing around with it just in my own free time. And I was just mind blown. Like, I started by sending, my family photos. I took old photos of our family photos and turned them into Ghibli. Like, I'm Asian, so obviously like they look kind of cool. And then, I just got fascinated by it, and I started kind of branching out into like, what other types of things can you generate with the new image models? And I also love Pixar, so I kind of started playing around with it. And then I started realizing, hey, we're probably, I wanted to have a shot at being like, hey, could I take this and apply this to my business, my startup somehow? And, I was like, let me, now that I can kind of create these kind of images and things and videos in ways that before AI, it was unthinkable to do, or like the cost of making videos like that would, it would take weeks or months. You'd have to hire an agency to like make it for you.
Absolutely.
I just started kind of playing around on nights and weekends when I had some free time. And I realized, holy crap, there's all these tools like Kling AI, Hedra. I was going on Reddit and down these rabbit holes on YouTube, and I was starting to realize like I could kind of make some of these videos myself, and the production quality can be actually like really high. So I just started kind of playing around with it, and ultimately, I'm a startup founder, so I wanted to, focus my time and kind of channel that into something that's valuable for my business. So I started making these kind of AI videos that kind of explain what we do, and, short sizzle reels. And then, at first I was like, okay, let me, I want to look good and kind of polished. And so Pixar is great because you can kind of like make yourself look like a character, but it also sort of looks like you. And then I started getting really creative with it. And I was like, look, people like to have, people on podcasts and create engaging content. So why don't I get a little creative and start, involving movie characters or celebrities to go on the podcast. So I started kind of creating all these like scripts and staging them. And that was what came out of it. And I was just so blown away by, one, how quickly I could make it. The cost was dirt cheap. I think I spent probably about $200 in credits total. Took me about 8 hours to make that video. It was like a 10-minute video, but obviously now that I've learned how to do it, it's going to be a lot faster. But I think we're in the early innings of exploring the kinds of creativity that AI can unlock, that can be used for businesses, for creative people to just create things that previously weren't accessible to normal people. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of the story of how that came through.
Dude, it's such a gangster story, but also just like how you leverage curiosity to really lean into all the options that are out there. And now you've got like a forward-facing, omnipresent, really engaging asset that you can leverage for the business as well, which is so sick.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. This idea, as you were talking, is like AI is enabling us to really democratize the execution of ideas. We've been talking with leaders in different organizations who, they own a web development shop with, 1,000 employees. And, what used to take a very senior person before, maybe like a more junior or mid-level programmer can do today with the power of AI. I'm curious, maybe some of the other tools that you get really excited about using, maybe in your personal life or day-to-day, that really kind of demystified some of this creation process.
Honestly, in my day to day, I use, I wouldn't say I use any AI tools heavily day to day as like a critical part of my organization or workflow, just because, my day to day is pretty boring. I take meetings, I do work, I, write some code, I have meetings with my internal team, but, what I would say is, for example, I use Superhuman. It's an email app that helps you kind of be more productive with email. And I am starting to see them leveraging like AI features to, make it easier to like send certain types of reminders, like have like snippets that they suggest based on email copy. And so I am starting to see the world in terms of like the day-to-day productivity tools that I use move a little bit more towards a world where the AI that's embedded in these products are starting to act a little bit more and more like personal assistants. And sometimes, it's early, so sometimes they're like off and they're bad, and I'm like, okay, like I need to do this manually. But every now and then there are like moments of delight where I'm like, that's really cool. It would have taken me, X amount of seconds, X amount of minutes to do something manually, and now it's like right there for me. That's really cool. And so I'm starting to see that. And I think we're in the early innings. I think as these models get better, as people make sort of like the products kind of improve, like we're just going to start seeing AI become more and more integrated into our life in subtle ways that create moments of delight and ultimately save people a lot of time.
So I want to give everybody a little bit of flavor about your background. So I know that, when we think about you as today as the co-founder of Glen Coco, everybody's like, okay, of course, I understand this kid's probably like a high school dropout. He probably, started this when he was in his room by himself, blah, blah, blah. But why don't you tell everybody about kind of like your journey and how you actually got here in the first place? 'Cause I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, very different from the high school dropout paradigm. I went to college. I went to a good college, so I got into MIT. So I definitely, I know some people dropped out, but I was like, let me get a degree from this place because it'll be a good notch on the belt. But I went to MIT, graduated. At the time, I was actually really interested in finance. My dad was an economics professor, and so I'd always been sort of fascinated by economics. I ended up working on Wall Street for my first job out of college. I was at Morgan Stanley as an interest rate derivatives trader. And so I spent about 5 years doing that. I was in New York, not suit, but like a collared shirt, showing up to work every day. That was a pretty stressful but exciting kind of learning job. The job was very intense. I was trading a lot of different markets all around the clock, so I was never really sleeping, and when you're trading, it's a lot like, I'd say, I'm in B2B sales now, but the easiest way to think about it is like trading's no different than sales, where you have a quota and you got to perform and there's no real hiding, and you either like hate your numbers or you don't and they fire you. So it's very like a scoreboard type of job. About 3 years into the job, I kind of had a realization where I was projecting out 5 to 7 years ahead, and I was like, is this my calling? Is this what I want to be doing for the next 10 years of my life? And I was trading fixed income products and interest rates, and mathematically they're pretty intellectually interesting and complex when you get into the nuts and bolts. There's a lot of like physics involved with it. But I remember like there were times when our office was in Times Square, and so I'd be in New York, and I remember just like I'd have really stressful days, and I would just like walk out of the building and a lot of work stuff would be on my mind. And I remember always like kind of laughing to myself because I'm taking the subway back home, and I'm thinking like, oh, TY moved 7 basis points, like this is gonna like totally screw me over. And I remember laughing because I'm like, no one in this subway that I'm commuting back with knows what the heck I just said. So it felt a little bit kind of like I was working in this like la la land that was pretty disconnected from reality. And so about 3 years in, I kind of made a decision that I didn't want to be working in finance in the long run. So where did that lead me? Well, at the time, I missed school. I'm a huge nerd and I like learning new things. And so I'd always been interested in law school. So I applied to law school. I got in. I deferred for a couple of years, and then I ended up going to law school after 2 more years at Morgan Stanley. And then at the same time, I have a brother who works in venture capital, and so right as I was about to start law school, he kind of planted the seed in my head where he's like, hey, I know you're doing the whole law school thing, but is that really what you want to do? I mean, I think, have you ever considered working at a startup? I think you'd kind of enjoy it. Based on your personality, I would say I'm pretty fast paced. I like kind of, certain intense environments and kind of kooky setups. So I was like, you know what? I never really thought about it, but I might as well like just see what's out there and check out the job market. So, this summer before I started law school, I kind of casually interviewed with a couple companies, and half of them didn't know what to do with me. I was a square peg in a round hole. They were like, they couldn't really see interest rate exotics options trader with any transferable skill sets to work in a startup. There are a couple companies who really like that. They were like, oh, like you seem smart. You don't know anything about what we do, but we can probably teach you and you'll figure things out. So one of those companies was a company called Verkada. They're now a pretty big company, but they basically sell physical security products. So think cameras, access control, alarm systems to buildings. At the time, they were relatively small, like 100, 150 people, based out of San Mateo, California. And I just got good vibes when I interviewed there. The founders and the chairman and the team seemed really smart, and there was like a cool energy that felt a lot like reminding me of the trading floor. So I took a leap of faith and I dropped out of law school and ended up relocating to California. And I spent about 2 to 3 years working there. I was doing sales operations and demand generation and growth. Incredibly rewarding experience. I learned more, I would say, in the 2 years I spent there than I did in any other 2 years spent in my life. It was a lot like drinking from a fire hose. Very fast paced, very intense. I think part of it too was I was just learning new things. For example, like I didn't know what CRM stood for. Like Salesforce. I had no idea what these things were. But it was great. I knew going into Verkada though that I wanted to spend maybe 2 to 3 years learning the ropes at a really good company before eventually starting my own thing. So everything I did at Verkada, I oriented myself around that, which is like, hey, like I'll work extra hours, not because I have to, but because like it's like I'm getting paid to go to school. You know, the alternative would have been to pay like $200,000 to go to law school. So I guess from that frame of mind of thinking, I was like, I'm getting paid to learn, so this is great.
Yeah.
And so I spent about 2 to 3 years there, and then right before I was kind of debating whether to you know, leave once my learning curve was kind of flattening in 2 years, and because I was starting to get this itch to like go and start something. I got a call from a then unknown cybersecurity company called Wiz. They had, I guess, through the grapevine, known I was working on growth and demand generation at Verkada. I would say we had a really strong team there. And they reached out and, you know, they're like, hey, you know, we heard about what you're doing. We'd love to see if you're interested in being our head of growth. You know, we're a cloud cybersecurity company based out of Israel. And at first I wasn't really considering it, but then, you know, the more I talked to them and met the team, I was like, oh, this is a really cool product. And you know, it's an Israeli company, and I'm a third culture kid. So I'm from Houston originally, but I grew up in South Korea, and I just like kind of international experiences. So I was like, I've worked for an American company for a couple of years. Like, let me go learn what the Israelis are like. So I was like, let me put off, you know, the startup decision for another year and go learn at this company. So I joined the company, and I was there for about a year. And then after a year, I finally got that strong itch where I was like, okay, now you've been like 3 years learning the ropes at some Series B to C stage companies. It's time now. And so that's kind of the backstory of how I kind of started and you know, what led me eventually to going out and starting my own company.
I think about the self-awareness that it takes to know when you're not on the right path. I'm curious, like, where you feel that maybe superpower to be able to pivot came from. Like, I feel, you know, Keenan and I, you know, often talk about this, but it seems like in the world today, so many people kind of live quiet lives of desperation, you know, living in their cubicle, hoping that one day things are going to change, and don't really take the action or have a plan to execute the steps that it takes to be able to get out of their situation. So where did that power to, you know, that power and courage to pivot really come from, do you think?
I would say, you know, all my life, and maybe this is a personal thing for me, but maybe it's something that we all have within us, but all my life I've never really optimized for the one thing. I've always let my curiosity and passions naturally take me places. And I think, you know, for example, this is going to sound crazy, but like long term, like 10 to 15 years down the road, I actually want to be in the movie business. I want to, you know, make movies. It's a total passion of mine, but the hard thing about movie business is you need money, or you can be a starving artist. And so I think I just tend to think a lot from a long-term perspective where I don't necessarily pigeonhole myself into like, you know, what I need to be doing right now, but try to keep in the back of my mind sort of like a 10 to 20 year vision of where I want to be in life. And also 10 to 20 years is a long time, you know? So when you have that sort of long-term, you know, sense of where you want to be going, but you also recognize that you have time to accumulate a lot of knowledge and you know, build up skill sets in different versatile areas, it kind of, for me at least, it gave me the freedom to be like, look, I can spend easily my 20s and 30s just learning and going into different domains. You know, I'm a first-time founder, so this has been like one of the most incredible learning experiences of my life as well. And I think also, like, you know, on the fear side of things, maybe, and this is, you know, maybe not as applicable to everyone, but I don't really feel fear, you know, of like job security or things. I tend to just operate, you know, from a first principles basis. Like I will be able to find something, but for me, a lot of my exploring different things is this intuitive sense I have that the more experiences you can accumulate in life, the more they can compound in the long run. And there's different philosophies of that. I've heard people say, hey, like, if you just stick at one thing for a long time, you can really kind of build a huge sort of, you can build a lot of capital in terms of your network and your learning and your skill sets. But for me, I've never really ascribed to that. I've tried to go as wide as I can and gain, significant experience. Like, it's not like I'm bouncing around like a rabbit, just like tasting something and then moving on. Like, I like to focus on things for 3 to 5 year spurts at a time and really kind of understand a problem space and get there. But I've never felt beholden to doing like one thing. Yeah.
Dude, this is a really cool opportunity if you throw in a quote. So everybody who's listening to the podcast and watching today has heard that the quote, "Jack of all trades, master of none." But the second part of that quote, what no one really includes, is "but oftentimes better than a master of one," is the full quote. And so when I think about your lived experience, man, and you being able to build all these skill sets that you can now deploy, right, at your future goal of being able to raise money, build a team, have the skill sets, market, being able to, we saw at the very beginning of today's episode, your ability and your passion to create Pixar-related like assets. You know what I mean? Like, you're building the skill set that's going to help you deploy in the future towards a bigger opportunity. And I wish people had the patience to be able to deploy, once again, the time frame mindset of like, hey, I can spend the next 20 years stacking up my skill sets, and then when I have an opportunity in front of me, I'm going to be able to go all in on this opportunity. That's a really healthy way to look at the world. But in the rush to get places, I think we all often miss that.
The other thing I will say is there is a little bit of a trade-off, right? Because when you're in a lane that you're in, there's an element of comfort to it, right? Which is like, things become routine, like. And for some people, like, career isn't the be all and end all, right? Some people are like, hey, I have a job, it's cool, but I have like a family, I have a life, I have, I like having a little freedom and space to have fun or enjoy life. And I think the trade-off is that when you do the kind of things or make the choices that I make, you kind of recognize that you're always going to be on a very steep learning curve. And it's basically like if you're going on the journey of life, and the journey of life is a hike across the mountain, you're basically committing yourself to always being on like a pretty steep hill, as opposed to kind of meandering and enjoying the valleys a little bit. So there's a trade-off, for sure.
What do you feel excited you most? Kind of pivoting into Glen Coco. So what do you think excited you most about starting Glen Coco? Like, what was the initial foundation of wanting to kick this thing off?
I think at heart, I like building things. And I think even when I was at Ricotta or Wiz, the act of standing something up from nothing or standing something bigger up from something small has always been rewarding to me. As opposed to coming into something that's big and built and just cranking that machine that's already been built for you. And I think what I like about it is the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the way it forces you to sometimes make decisions where you don't know if it's the right decision. And I think that challenge and applying that to solving kind of real world problems is, I just get a real adrenaline rush and kick out of that. I think I could do that all my life, over and over and over again. It's just something that I'm wired. It's like I'm wired that way. And so for me, as I was doing that in small doses at these companies where I was scaling up operations and things like that, I realized two things, which is, the first is there are certain limits to what you can build within a company, right? Like you build something up, you stand something up, and eventually as processes get built out, more people come into it, things slow down, and you start hitting a learning curve what you can continue to build. And maybe you could do that in over and over again within the company. But there are limits to agency. If someone from above is like, hey, this isn't like a big strategic initiative and you disagree, you can voice your disagreement, but at the end of the day, you are, to some extent, a lieutenant or sort of like someone who has to kind of follow the marching orders from the top down. But I think I was kind of I just got a small dose of that, and I was like, the logical extension, if you're someone that likes building things, is to go start a startup where like you are the one kind of making those decisions, or you're working with your team to kind of do that. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's like going out into really, really rocky ocean and kind of figuring things out as you go through that, and there's no safe harbor. But yeah, I would say that's kind of how I think about it.
I heard Naval Ravikant on a podcast recently talking about the concept of intelligence. And he was like, often we know in the common framework of education, we think about as intelligence as your ability to consume information and then regurgitate it, right, on a testing format. But how I look at intelligence is the way for you to be able to use your life experience and your knowledge that you've accumulated to get what you want. And I hear a lot of intelligence coming out of you today, talking about your long-term vision of what you're looking for, but you also have used your life experiences along the way to accumulate the skill sets that help you accomplish what you want as well. And like, that's a really cool reframe that I've never really seen somebody demonstrate until like today's conversation. It's been super cool, man. And I mean, like, a huge nod to you, because you're kind of one of those people where it's either, life happens to some people, but often people happen to life as well. And it seems like you've been carving your entire path the entire way, man.
Appreciate that. Yeah,
different way to kind of look at it. So I mean, let's talk a little bit about, and Dante, I want you to do a little screen share for us here, man, because we've started off on that foot. I want to talk about kind of the landscape of like AI SDRs and some of maybe the bad actors that have kind of come along the way. So Dante, why don't you rip this segment for us, man, and give us the intro?
Yeah, I'm really curious on your take. This has been such a fast evolving space, right? And I want to be cautious because we're recording of using particular names just to not disparage anyone. So maybe I'm not going to screen share Keenan.
Okay.
But there have been bad actors. I know a couple companies who got into the space. They made promises of, you're going to massively 10x your business, 11x, 12x, 13x your business, and they fell short, very short of those promises. Worst case story is I spent tens of thousands of dollars over the course of a year. I got one lead, right? So how do you feel that these past bad actors has affected the marketplace when it comes to being able to trust the next AI SDR company or people who are even enabled with AI?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying I sympathize and empathize to a large extent to the struggle that fast-growing startups face. There's a tremendous amount of pressure, and if I were to list out all the businesses and companies that have grown historically big or done something generational that at some point along the way had to do a little bit of, fake it till you make it in various different forms. I remember reading a story about how Reddit in the early days, no one was posting in the forum, so the founders would literally just fake posts and just create posts.
I heard this too. Yeah.
seed the forum and get some, and that company's been around, and now they're, creating a lot of value. People use it a lot to, I use Reddit a lot now and find out information. So I think every startup goes through these kinds of like growing pains and learning curves. I do think there's a fine line between doing that and committing fraud or kind of misleading investors from a financial perspective. And so, obviously I'm not in these boardrooms, or I'm not in these discussions, or I don't know the exact context of what happened, but where there's smoke, there's fire, unequivocally. TechCrunch doesn't put out an article like that for no reason. And I'd actually heard about the news 2 weeks before the news broke. And I was like, oh man, so I simultaneously sympathize and empathize, but also think that generally speaking, it's not a good look for the ecosystem for all startups that are building in AI and sales. We obviously want to support each other, and a loss to a reputational loss is a reputational hit to the entire community, right? And so I think it's not a great thing for other AI sales tech startups, but I think we're in the early innings, and whether it's 11x or whether it's other companies that end up making it, I do think a lot of businesses will build really amazing companies off of leveraging AI to, enable SDRs. Now, do I think AI can completely replace SDRs? Like, absolutely not, for a lot of reasons. But I think, again, we're in the early innings of building really awesome things, and I'm excited to see, what continues, playing out in this landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, there's a quote that says, a smart man makes a mistake, learns from it, and never makes it again. But a wise man finds a smart man and learns from him to avoid the mistakes that he made altogether. Right. And I think that that's where kind of we can use a company like 11x as kind of like a signal to the marketplace that says like, hey, for other people who are in this space, like Glen Coco as an example, right, here are some things that we shouldn't do to be able to build trust in the marketplace as we kind of move forward, which is amazing. How do you kind of handle some of that news like internally, right, about like kind of some of the other bad actors in the marketplace? I think that's an interesting kind of conversation for us to have, because it's always, as a founder, we're talking about the future, but when somebody kind of puts a bad mark on the industry's kind of reputation, how do you kind of handle that internally with the team as well?
Man, there's so many. It's like a video game where you can kind of choose to be a villain or a hero. And you can win video games as a villain or a hero. And the reason I bring that up is, when it comes to like marketing or talking about other customers, there was a ton of LinkedIn activity right after the news came out, and LinkedIn is absurd in its own ways, but obviously you have I told you so, like, it was just like, oh my God, like I need to like get off LinkedIn for a couple of days because it's just like, it's just like toxic. But and then there were some people who were like sympathetic about what happened. Like I mentioned, early stage startup struggles and things like that. But I think to maybe open the kimono a little bit in terms of like what kind of discussions we were having internally as a team, I think the biggest questions are around like, do we leverage this from a marketing perspective to build awareness? I know Ample Market, for example, they literally like changed their landing page to kind of like bring something up about 11x, and I don't know, every company can approach it differently. Like there's a lot of, you can, if you create pipeline, or, if a company is going under, and obviously it wouldn't be dumb, I would say, if you're a competitor, to reach out to companies that are going under and reach out to their customers if the news is public, for example, obviously, and just be like, hey, we can help migrate you and things like that. That's adding value to the customer and also adding value to your business. There's probably like thoughtful ways to do that. But I think a lot of our discussions internally were around like, hey, like, who are we as a company, and how do we want to position ourselves? And I think it's, like personally, I like memes and I like kind of making jokes about it, but I think, you want to find a reasonable line between, coming across as professional and taking the high road, and not being, too sort of like down on it. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
I'd love to just catch the audience up on exactly what you guys do. In our previous conversation, you're like, the best way to think about Glen Coco is we are the Uber of SDRs. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so think of us as a marketplace, where marketplace has two sides. On the one side, we have a way for people to fractionally do SDR work for companies, and companies have a way to quickly build out outbound campaigns or run outbound cold calling channels by connecting with these fractional SDRs in a marketplace. So it is Uber in the sense that, people on the fractional contractors in a marketplace can set their own hours. they're not necessarily beholden to working, full time, and it's heavy, and they have to work like 40, 50 hours a week. But also companies have like flexibility. And the key insight is that, generally speaking, and I've seen this movie, at a lot of companies, but the SDR space, and that's why so many people are excited about AI replacing SDRs, because it's such a tough job. You really have to sympathize with the nature of the job. It's like, get out and make a bunch of cold calls, send a bunch of emails. 80% of the time, people don't want to talk to you, and you're just trying to hit your quota and get meetings set for your business. And it's not rocket science, because you're making cold calls and sending out emails. It's also not like anyone can do it, because you have to know how to connect with people on the phone and have a good conversation and be able to explain your product, and kind of be well organized. But the insight for us is that it's a pretty high turnover business. Statistically, the average tenure of a sales development rep as a company is only 6 to 9 months. And the reason why is because it's a very up or out model. You can't really do it for 10 years straight without burning out. And so it's oftentimes like people will use that as an entry point to then become like an account executive at a company. Or every now and then you do have like, real sort of creatures in the space. And I mean that in the best way, who just love it and love the game, and they're addicted to it, and amazing. Like if that's what you were born and put on earth to do, like good for you. But companies, when they're making layoffs or things like that, oftentimes the SDR channel will be the first to go. So it's just a high turnover churn kind of space, both because of like non-regrettable churn where people actually get promoted from the role, and regrettable churn where people are getting laid off. And so there's a lot of people who can do the job. And so we were like, why don't we create a marketplace where people can match and find work with companies?
I think that this is also a great bridge into kind of like some of the tailwinds of where society's at. When I'm on social media and stuff like that, I see a whole bunch of younger generations, right? Younger kids who are looking to get into sales because they've been looking at people who they look up to, who are a part of, setters, and they send up these businesses and stuff like that. And I mean, Uber in itself was a way to give people freedom by being able to control their own schedule. So what do you kind of think about like the future vision of like remote work and the skill set, which is in high demand, of sales and SDR being a part of kind of like this new digital gig economy that's kind of evolved in this new world that we live in?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge thesis underpinning, why we're building Glen Coco. We think that in the long run, people are going to become more comfortable with monetizing online in non-traditional ways where you get hired and you're W-2 for a company. I think someone was telling me like 1099 as a concept didn't even exist, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Uber kind of really came in and changed that. But the nice thing about, making cold calls or doing kind of fractional SDR work is all you need is a computer and a laptop and a quiet place, and you can kind of do it from wherever. You don't even need a car like Uber. And I think like there are going to be a lot of tailwinds where increasingly, as we spend more and more of our time online, on computers, in the digital world, there's going to be like really great opportunities for people to find opportunities from an income perspective in lots of different creative ways. So I think Glen Coco represents one of many different sort of like avenues to monetize your time online. You can be a content creator, you can, sell things. If you want to develop apps really quickly and sell them now, their barrier to entry is a lot lower. So yeah, pretty excited.
Ingwon, I'm curious your take on this tailwind that we have called founder-led marketing. As a founder, going out there, championing, being able to post on LinkedIn, be on podcasts, be the voice of the brand, and really personify the values to attract the ideal customers or talent. I'm curious your 2 cents on this idea.
I mean, I think it's great. I think technology has enabled that distribution in ways that were unthinkable 10 to 20 years ago. I think people are increasingly looking for forms of authenticity in an AI, increasingly digital sort of like world where attention spans are a lot shorter, and so I think founder-led sales is just a kind of extension of what you've been seeing from a macro perspective over the past 10 to 15 years, where creators as a concept, where people just go and talk about themselves, like it started, mukbangs in the early days of people just like eating food and people fascinated and looking at people. Creators who are just creating all kinds of weird wacky things on, it started with YouTube, migrated over to TikTok, and so I think people are just used to seeing faces of real people a lot more online and on their screens than compared to say like 20 years ago, where like the only people you could really see on screens were like celebrities and actors and actresses. Even athletes were kind of mythical creatures where there was a barrier between accessibility to these athletes, through like media and traditional forms of ESPN. And now everyone has their own TikTok and everyone has their own Instagram. And the point about the personal brand, I think it's simultaneously never been easier for people to kind of create their own personal brands online, and also never more important if you're looking to commercialize your time. And I think as a founder, why wouldn't you leverage that as a channel to apply that to your business? People like authenticity, people like founders and leaders who are involved and care about the business. So rather than having marketing teams do it on your behalf, like why not kind of lead the way? And I think if you're a startup, it's one of the lowest cost ways to start kind of like creating a brand around your business, and your business is your baby, right? So just being out there, being authentic, kind of sometimes being vulnerable or sometimes being creative. I think I've been seeing a lot of success with a lot of founders who've been able to leverage that for sure.
I mean, there's a couple really cool channels and some stats that I want to share too. I mean, so there's some statistic that talks about like how long does it really take for you to become friends with somebody, right? Or at least view them as a friend in your own life. And that number is about 50 hours of time spent with somebody else. It means that you actually look at them as one of your friends. You know enough about them, you spend enough time together. But when we think about kind of how media can like accelerate this time, creating content, being out in front of the community, being in conversations that are meaningful, sharing your opinions, allows for people to spend time with you. And so hopefully at the end of their consumption of these podcast episodes and the media and the content that you create, they actually view you as a friend. So it actually can be used as kind of like a superpower. You know what I mean? Of like being able to create reciprocity in the marketplace as well. And it's cool that there are statistics behind it, but a completely different way for us to build relationships with people at scale now.
Yeah.
So here's one of the questions that I want to ask a little bit about you is kind of what is the future of Glen Coco going to look like, right? I mean, you've gone from operator to architect. You talk about your days are boring now. You're writing some code, internal meetings, taking some meetings with the team, stuff like that. So like what is kind of I'm a big baseball guy. What's your Babe Ruth moment where you're standing at home plate, calling your shot to center field, you're going to hit your home run? What does 2025, 2026 look like for you guys?
Well, first of all, let me disabuse you with the notion that things are boring, or I would say every day is there's something, and it's very dynamic and fun and stressful and everything at the same time. I think we're in the very early innings. Building a marketplace takes time, and we do have a long-term vision where we kind of want to be, not just, we are a marketplace, but unlike say an Uber or LinkedIn where you're just matching people and then getting out of the way, we built a lot of AI sales tooling into our marketplace. So our long-term vision is that we just want to be the one-stop shop and platform, almost like a Shopify, for all things outbound sales, where businesses and people just know it as a trusted brand and they can go to it to quickly deploy time and hours and tooling and processes to get sales meetings. That's a big vision. I think it's going to take years and years to continue scaling that up. You could grow this internationally. You could continue to scale it into the US. It's a big market. Every think about every business that's doing business to business that needs sales. Like theoretically, like any business could use Glen Coco, and theoretically, almost everyone can, on the other side, theoretically earn income, using Glen Coco. So in terms of like the Babe Ruth analogy of calling the shot, I think by starting this company, we are kind of calling that shot. But I think the biggest kind of learning that I've learned from the startup is Mark Andreessen said something. He has a famous quote where he says, "There's no such thing as magic bullets. There are only lead bullets." And I kind of think about it the same way, where you can hit home runs, but it's not like a business becomes big because you hit a home run. You have to hit home runs over and over and over again, and you have to continue executing for years and years. And every stage of the journey is going to be different. And so I can't really say there's like one sort of like home run moment. It's more just about incrementally continuing to, try to hit home runs every day, every week with the team and for our users and our customers. Yeah.
I love it, man. Well, we can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast, man. Seriously, this has been an absolute blast hearing about your perspectives on what is happening, the changing landscapes of all this technology, your experience, right, and everything that you've done. Thinking on longer time horizons has been amazing. One of the things that we do here on the podcast is our previous guest to end us wants to ask you a blind question. Now, this is a leader, 3-time CEO, huge in leadership, and he wants to know, what skill sets have you had to develop to become the leader who you want to become?
That's a great question. I think the skill set that I've had to develop is learning how to give away your Legos when the time is right and knowing when the time is right.
Well, man, we appreciate the time, brother. Seriously. It's been an amazing conversation. Once again, everybody, thanks for tuning in, watching, and listening today. That's been the pod. We'll catch you in the next one.
Take care.